Right, good morning, everyone. I think we'll get started. Thanks so much for being here today. I am Caroline Green. I'm the Director of Research at the Institute for Ethics in AI. And it's a real pleasure to welcome you all this morning for our discussion with Professor Jessica Riskin, following her lecture last night with the title, The Onion Axiom, A History of the Outside-In Approach to Artificial and Natural Intelligence. Who here, if we have a little show of hands, managed to be at the lecture last night?
Oh, most people.
Yeah, most people, so that's great. But for those people who were not able to attend last night's lecture, I'm just going to introduce Jessica to you. So Jessica Riskin is the Francis and Charles Field Professor of History at Stanford University, where she teaches modern European history and the history of science. Her work examines the changing nature of scientific explanation, the relations of science, culture, and politics, and the history of theories of life and mind. Her books include The Restless Clock, a history of the centuries-long argument over what makes living things tick, which was awarded the 2021 Patrick Suppes Prize in the History of Science from the American Philosophical Society, and Science in the Age of Sensibility in 2002, which received the American Historical Association's J. Russell Major Prize for the Best Book in French History. She is also a regular contributor to various publications, including Aeon, the Los Angeles Review of Books, and the New York Review of Books. So, Jessica, thank you again for joining us this morning, for giving us more of your time. We already had a bit of Q&A and discussion last night, but I feel really lucky that we've got you again and that we can have more of a discussion this morning with everyone here in the room. I would also like to welcome two of our colleagues, Ruben Binns and David Storrs-Fox, who will offer their perspectives on the lecture. So I'll just introduce both of them. So Ruben is an associate professor of human-centered computing, working between computer science, law, and philosophy, focusing on data protection, machine learning, and the regulation of and by technology. Between 2018 and 2020, he was a postdoctoral research fellow in AI at the Information Commissioner's Office, addressing AI, machine learning, and data protection. And he joined the Department of Computer Science at the University of Oxford as a postdoc researcher in 2015. So welcome, Ruben. And David is an early career research fellow at our institute and a junior research fellow at Jesus College. He's also a lecturer in philosophy at St. Catherine's College and a research associate at the Institute for Ethics and Technology at Hamburg University. David works in moral philosophy, metaphysics, and the philosophy of action. And the central idea of his recent work is that there's nothing whatsoever that agents in our world are infallibly able to do.
Sounds about right.
So he argues that this idea has important ethical implications, so we'll hear more about this. I'm sure his current research concerns the ethics of groups that are composed of both human and AI agents. And I think you've also been doing work on the environment and so on. So so this is, and just to tell you a little bit about myself, I have a background in human rights, but I'm a gerontologist, so I look at aging, and I'm interested in how AI can support our aging populations, and I'm really interested in responsible AI in that field. So this is how this morning is going to work. Jessica will start us off with a summary of some of the main points of your lecture. And then we will hear from our two commentators, and then I will open up the discussion to the audience. Okay, over to you, Jessica.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you, Caroline, for this wonderful hosting and having me here, and Ruben and David for the engagement with the work, although maybe I should wait until after I hear what you have to say. No. And I really wanted to also thank Jacqueline Wright and Graham Bagley for setting everything up. It's been really such a wonderful visit. Let's see. I'll start with the onion axiom, which is the title of yesterday's lecture, which is my name for the idea that basically intelligence is a figment. It doesn't really exist. If you knew every single thing that's going on in a brain, you would lose any sense that the owner of the brain was intelligent. You peel away all the layers of the onion. There's nothing in the middle. It's empty. And I have been struck by, well, first of all, historically speaking, the fact that this has been a kind of informing axiom throughout the history of artificial intelligence, going back to the middle of the 20th century with cybernetics, sort of the two main traditions, the cybernetics tradition, where people designed electromechanical animals, creatures of various kinds, and observed their behaviors, so-called, but assumed that you had to sort of equate the appearance of sentience and sociability and engagement and self-recognition, all the things that these creatures seem to exhibit. You had to equate those things with their appearance, because if you think about what's going on inside the machine, you lose any sense that it has any of those capacities. So cybernetics is one tradition. Alan Turing represents the kind of more purely theoretical tradition. So I went back to his work in around 1950, especially his kind of landmark paper on computing machinery and intelligence, in which he introduces the idea of the Turing test, this test to evaluate whether a machine is intelligent by engaging it in conversation along with a human being, both hidden behind screens or in another room or something. And if each trying to persuade the human examiner that they're really the human, and he says if the machine can win, then we should accord it the courtesy of assuming that it's intelligent. Once again, his assumption is that the intelligence is just the appearance of intelligence, that this evaluation is necessarily purely external, and if you knew everything that was going on inside the machine, you would no longer have a sense that it was intelligent. But he says the same thing is true of human beings, human beings, if you knew how their behaviors were governed by a set of rules, then you would lose any sense that they were intelligent. And in fact, Turing said, he thought human behaviors were governed by a set of behavioral rules. And so this seems to me a very strange and rather contortionist idea, because, of course, we have huge amounts of empirical experience of minds and personhoods, not just in human beings, but in other kinds of animals all around us. And so in order to decide that all of that is just a figment of our ignorance about how it works, seems to me to be a kind of gymnastic idea, a strange idea, and quite a recent one. I think really, an idea of the 20th century. And then at the end of the lecture, I talked about how, I'll just say, Turing had predicted that by the end of the 20th century, there would be machines that could win the imitation game, the Turing test, 30% of the time, and that would be enough to consider that machines were intelligent. That didn't quite happen, but just 25 years later than he predicted, there are now the new AIs. Many people describe them as being able to win. There's one paper from March that says that in a kind of formally Turing test situation, the researchers found that the machine actually won not in 30%, but in 73% of cases. On the other hand, the researchers themselves in that paper said that they don't really think it means that the machine has human-like intelligence, that it used cheap tricks, and they don't think it's... So there's some debate about it, but it seems anyway quite conceivable that if the LLMs are not now winning the Turing test, or passing the Turing test, they will soon be passing the Turing test. And yet, I don't think there are any kind of serious commentators on the subject who regard the LLMs as having minds or selves or personhood. And so I suggested that, in fact, if the LLMs pass the Turing test, they actually disprove Turing's model of human intelligence, which is that it doesn't exist, that it's just its appearance. Because here are machines that can present the appearance, but are not, nobody regards them as intelligent in a human sense. And the ethical implications of this, I think, so the general ethical principle that I was proposing yesterday was that basically the onion axiom is false, that living intelligence, sentient intelligence, is not just its appearance. It's not a figment of our ignorance about how things work, it exists in the world. It's a feature of the world and not a figment of the imagination. And I think, I suggested yesterday that a kind of reductive understanding of human intelligence, the cyberneticists and AI tradition were carrying a reigning reductive approach to intelligence to its extreme by reducing intelligence clean out of existence. That reductive approach to intelligence in the early to mid, across the kind of middle decades of the 20th century, I think did enormous harm, ethical harm in the world through intelligence testing, in educational tracking by race and class and sex, in eugenic programs that resulted in the forced sterilizations in the United States of tens of thousands of people. I think, I suggested that Amartya Sen, the moral philosopher and economist, Amartya Sen's principle that ethical programs and economic development should be focused on personhood and sort of selfhood is an important ethical principle. And I don't think that the AI, the originators of cybernetics and AI had any pernicious purpose in mind, but nevertheless they participated in this rather dark program of the kind of scientific denial of the existence of anything like mind or mind-made meaning or selfhood in the world. And that larger program did a great deal of harm. And so that was the ethical principle I suggested at the end, which is that perhaps the new LLMs are showing us that the onion axiom is false. Okay, so maybe I'll stop there. Maybe that's enough
Thank
summary.
you. Thanks so much, Jessica. I'll now hand over to Ruben for the first comment, if that's okay.
Just a point, are we going to do multiple rounds, or should I?
We'll have lots of discussions,
Okay.
so whatever you're most comfortable with.
Okay, great, thank you. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful talk yesterday. It's been stewing in my mind overnight, and there are so many interesting different directions we could take the conversation in. So I thought I would start off with, I think there was a number of allusions in your talk towards magic, and at least the idea of becoming disenchanted with the notion that some agent has a self, an I, an intelligence that is precipitated by this peeling back of the layers of the onion. So by peeling back successive layers and believing that we found nothing in the middle, we become disenchanted with the idea that they're intelligent. And I realise this is something that I have been actively trying to do when talking to lay people about AI. I've been trying to disenchant them to the extent that they've become convinced that there is something there. My sort of response has been to try and disenchant them by thinking of ways to convey the enormous amount of data, compute, and human labour that's gone into the creation of these things. And it strikes me that it's a little bit like these expensive, elaborate stage magic shows where confronted with an explanation of how the trick is performed, it turns out that it's just a huge amount of brute force. It's people planted in the audience, people preparing months in advance for various aspects of the trick, and confronted with extremely elaborate stage magic tricks like that. Some people might actually believe that no, actually it's really more plausible that the magician really is psychic, right? Because who would go to so much effort to do that? So I wonder if there's an element of when I've been trying to disenchant people about AI, if there's something similar at play there. So that was my first thought, and then I guess we had Vice Chancellor of the university at the talk yesterday, who is a neuroscientist by trade, and she said that we really don't understand how the brain generates perception and pain and all these other states. And so is it that we are in a situation where there's something about the enormity of the trick that is being performed that once it goes beyond sort of human comprehension, we're then satisfied because we can remain enchanted with the subject of study. So yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
So should I?
Why did you reply?
Okay. No, that's lovely. I like that. I like the idea that the AIs are kind of a very, very elaborate stage magic. That's lovely. So when you're talking about disenchanting people, you mean disenchanting people with the AIs, but not disenchanting people. I mean, as I understand it, the cyberneticists in Turing were meaning to disenchant people with living intelligence, to point out to them that really it's just a lot of moving parts, and if you knew all the moving parts, you would see that there's actually nothing at all there. It's kind of extreme of disenchantment, but you're suggesting now that in fact, since we remain unable to do that, as long as we arrive at something that we don't understand how it works, we'll figure that it's equivalent to this other thing that we don't understand how it works, which is perception and consciousness. Yeah, that seems plausible to me. I was struck yesterday when Vice Chancellor Tracy was talking about that. I had begun the lecture with a kind of prologue about Leibniz's thought experiment, in which he imagines that there's an enormous giant machine the size of a mill, he says, that is able to think and perceive and feel, and you could go in and walk all around inside of it. And he says if you could do that, you would not understand. You would see all the moving parts, you could chart every movement, but you still wouldn't understand what consciousness or perception is, or mind, because they're in the substance, not in the motions. No moving parts can ever account for it. And she basically, seems to me, confirms that. Basically, that's what neuroscientists can do. It may not be a giant machine, but they go inside the machine and they look at all the moving parts and all the neurochemical pathways and whatever. And so they can describe what happens, I think, on quite a detailed level. And it doesn't help. It doesn't tell you what perception is. So it seems to me that Leibniz was right. She's carrying out the exact experiment that he described in miniature, and showing that it doesn't shed any light. So I guess I'm just sort of agreeing with you that it's a good way of thinking about it. I think that you can't underestimate the profit motive. So that's stage magic. Maybe that's true with all stage magicians, that they want to make a buck, but there's so much money now, I think, in playing that trick on people on a large scale. And that seems to me to be, an important part of the story. So people are being suckered by it because there's a lot of interest in suckering them.
Yeah, that's one of the, I guess now we see that continuum talking about AGI, artificial general intelligence, and that race which is now led by these tech companies that have a stake, a financial stake, and at making sure that they are the first ones who find AGI.
And I don't know whether, this group probably, I don't know anything about how plausible that is, not being an engineer or, the current technology. I wouldn't want to try to predict, but I wonder what people think about the plausibility of that idea. AGI, and AGI, as I understand it, would be something like what I've been describing as personhood or selfhood. And it doesn't seem to me like we've been getting closer to that. We've been following farther and farther and farther along an engineering tradition that is founded on the assumption of a hollow in the middle, so for a self to suddenly blossom would be kind of magical, it seems to me. But I don't know what people who are,
Let's pick that point up. I think this is a point that we can discuss with everybody later on.
Yeah.
The plausibility of AGI, I think, a really important point. Let's hear from David first, and then we go back to that.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for a fascinating talk. I found it really interesting and a great tour through the history of AI and cognitive science and so on. So I guess in my comments, I wanted to focus, just drill in on the onion axiom, on what it says and what it really requires and so on. So as I understand it, at the heart of the onion axiom is a kind of physicalist or materialist view of the human person and of human intelligence. We are like other physical objects, so we can think of tables and chairs and so on, right? These are composed of much smaller parts, and those parts, philosophers sometimes talk about those parts as grounding or constituting those entities. They are in some way enough to give you the table or the chair. So as it's sometimes put metaphorically, if God were to create all the microphysical parts of the chair, arrange them chairwise, you've got a chair. He doesn't need to do anything further to give you the chair, right? And so I take it that part of the onion axiom says that human beings are like this, that we are composed of these microscopic physical parts that interact in certain ways with each other and with the environment and so on. And once you've got that structure of very tiny physical parts, then you automatically got the human person, the mind, and so on. And importantly, the onion axiom proponents are going to say, at those kinds of more fundamental levels, say at the level of physics or something like that, we don't need to posit entities that themselves have intelligence or mind or anything like that. So as you say, the intelligence or mind kind of drops out of that level, but it's a kind of non-fundamental thing. And so I wanted to ask about, I guess, firstly two versions of, well, I think are both versions of the onion axiom, and maybe you can tell me if they're not. The one I think you were more focused on in the talk is what we could call a nihilist version, that says everything I just said, and then also says, maybe because of that, there isn't anything at the higher level, right? So applied to chairs, the equivalent view would be, there actually isn't a chair, strictly speaking. There's just a bunch of microphysical stuff arranged in a certain way, but there isn't really a chair there. And so the comparable view about intelligence looks at all the microphysical or neurological things that implement intelligence, and says, given that is in some way sufficient for mind and intelligence, there really isn't mind or intelligence there at all, right? And so I guess that's suggested by the quotation of Ashby you gave, where I forget exactly, I wrote it down somewhere. Real intelligence does not exist, right?
It is a myth,
right? A myth, right? So there's another way that someone might develop still the same general physicalist, materialist view, which says, no, real intelligence does exist. It's just not fundamental, right? Tables and chairs exist. They're not fundamental. They are entirely constituted by or grounded by these low-level phenomena, but we don't need to say they're not there, right? There's real human intelligence. It's just that we can give this account of what gives rise to it and what is sufficient for it, and in particular an account where you don't need to put mental phenomena on the lowest level. So I guess my first question then, so I take it that both of those are, according to you, versions of the onion axiom. But my first question is, to me, the second version seems rather less crazy, right? And I'm wondering, when we look at, say, what people like Ashby, and when we look at kind of the history of this, of these disciplines, and we look at what they say, and they say things that seem quite bizarre, like there isn't any real intelligence and so on. How do we distinguish between just odd things scientists say and things that are really driving their research program or are kind of required for their research program? Mm-hmm. So you might think that the second view I outlined would be perfectly fine for the kinds of research programs they're carrying out. And so maybe they had some odd views, but really they don't need this more nihilistic view as an assumption or an axiom to drive their projects.
Yeah.
So that's the first question. Just kind of how do we distinguish between those kinds of things, like stuff scientists say versus things that are really fundamental to their project? And then just relatedly, so I take it you would also cast doubt on what I've thought of as that second kind of realist position. You would think that also is getting something wrong here. So this is the view. So I think that came out in your discussion of John Searle, who certainly wouldn't say there is no mind or intelligence, right? But he would, as you say, deny that those phenomena are fundamental. So I guess what I want to ask is, I think probably construed in that way, many of us are in the grip of the onion axiom, maybe even me. And so I wonder if maybe looking across the history of thought, there are useful models that we can apply to kind of free ourselves from that grip. Should we be looking? I think you don't want to look to kind of Cartesian dualism as an alternative. It is an alternative, but it's maybe not an alternative you're sympathetic to as a kind of place to look for inspiration here. Should we be looking to a more kind of panpsychist view of the sort associated with Spinoza, where you get kind of mental phenomena at the most fundamental level, but they're not kind of full minds or souls of the sort that Descartes is talking about? But even at this fundamental level, we get some kind of rudimentary mentality that then we're constructed out of. Should we be looking elsewhere? Are there other kind of useful historical models for kind of freeing ourselves from the grip of the Ionian axiom? So maybe I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Terrific. Thank you very much. Let me see. Let me start with the physicalist model, and I'll kind of work my way through. So, first of all, I'm not sure what I think about the physicalist model as applied to the Ionian axiom. I mean, on some level, as I was saying yesterday in the lecture, there seems to be an assumption that the specific material doesn't matter. I think that's what Searle was criticizing, right? The idea that you could make an intelligence out of any kind of substance, that it really is the moving parts, the motion of the moving parts. That kind of mechanist idea seems to me to abstract the mind from the matter in a weird way. At some point, I was teaching it when I was teaching at MIT. I remember we were talking about these. I was teaching kind of the long prehistory of computing, and I was talking about Hero of Alexandria, the ancient Greek engineer who designed these elaborate systems of siphons, like nests of chambers with siphons connecting them, and little twittering birds at the top, figures of birds, bird automata. And as the chamber, you would pour water through, and as the siphons would siphon variously, they would blow air out through tubes, and the birds would flutter and chirp. And I was showing this to these engineering students at MIT, one of whom said, okay, well, a siphon is just a transistor. It has two states, siphoning or not siphoning. Anything you can do with a transistor, you should be able to do with a siphon. And I think that's the general attitude with artificial intelligence as well. It doesn't matter what the matter is. And that seems like a non-physicalist idea in a strange way. So, furthermore, I don't know, I'm sort of thinking out loud, so I'm not sure quite how this connects, but I don't, as I said yesterday, I'm not a religious person. I don't particularly believe in soul. But it does seem to me that one can believe in an empirically demonstrated phenomenon, even if you don't understand how that phenomenon works. I can't explain how perception or intelligence work. But that doesn't mean that I have to deny their existence in order to not be appealing to magic. And or I have to insist that they can be explained in a particular way that I do understand how it works, which is clockwork, or moving parts, or else they're magic. And I suggested yesterday that that kind of collapsing of what counts as scientific explanation and everything else is magic, I think that took place at a particular moment, or maybe a series of moments over time, but there was a particularly crucial moment around the time of the founding of AI, kind of early 20th century. And there's a sort of politics to that scientists and engineers began to insist on, especially police the boundaries of what counts as a scientific explanation and what does not count. And a scientific explanation has to take this kind of engineering form of the mechanical explanation, reductive mechanical explanation of an essentially passive entity, artifact, in order to count, and anything else is an appeal to magic or mysticism. And I had suggested yesterday, this is I have a book about this, the kind of theological politics of this, right? That in the later 19th century, in order to make scientific theories like evolutionary theory consistent with a designer God in that period, people who wanted to establish Darwinian evolutionary theory wanted to make it consistent with religious belief in a designer God. And that's why there was a kind of insistence on the part of people like August Weismann, the sort of great reinterpreter of Darwin, insisted on the passivity of the evolving organism precisely in order to preserve a role for a designer God. So in a sense, the theological tradition was the one that rendered living things as inert artifacts. And there was a kind of reversal where people said, but if you're going to appeal to mind, that is, you know, a return to this kind of benighted, old-fashioned appeal to magic and mysticism. So anyway, I'm reacting against the idea of physicalism and pointing out that there are sort of holes in the physicalism of the reductionists. Okay, your two versions, the nihilist version, which is there's no real chairs at all, the Ashby version, and the seemingly more reasonable version of Searle, which is it doesn't exist on the most fundamental level. You have brute, he calls it brute mechanical causes. There's no mind on the, but on an epiphenomenal level, we can still have intelligence and perception. T.H. Huxley said something like that in the 60s or 70s, in his essay on automata. T.H. Huxley said that consciousness is like the bell on a locomotive, on a steam engine. You know, that it's an epiphenomenal thing. It doesn't cause anything, and it's not in the fundamental works, but it's just this kind of frill that emerges. Charles Darwin, incidentally, really hated that idea in that essay. So Darwin's version of a science of living beings, I think Darwin became an atheist by the end of his life. He pretty explicitly says that in his autobiography. And yet, he rejected that idea of that mind could only be epiphenomenal. In his version of his theory, mind played a causal role in evolutionary development. But I think, it seems to me, the second one, you're saying many people still subscribe to the second one. And I wonder if there's a rigorous distinction between them. It seems to me that the second one, it's like a polite version of the first one, but it arrives at the same thing. You know, if mind is playing no causal role in the world, and it's not really there on a fundamental level, it's sort of inert in a strange way. I don't know. I'm not sure that I see a firm distinction between those two. And so when you say that maybe scientists say all kinds of things, but really it's number two, that's, you know, it's that second idea that mind is epiphenomenal that's driving their research program. Well, if you have a research program like the cyberneticist or like Rodney Brooks, who's, you know, still with us, I mean, now I think he's doing very different kinds of work, more commercial work rather than research, but nevertheless, it's still pretty current. That research program, maybe it's founded on the idea that mind is epiphenomenal, but what it consists of is making things that look sentient and responsive and intelligent, but if there's no one in there. I mean, if you know everything about them, you know that really they're not. So it seems to me that it comes back, or the LLMs that we have now, it comes back to the same thing. I think version number 2 somehow collapses back into version number 1. I think it's an excellent question. Where could we look in the history of ideas for models that are neither version number 1 nor version number 2 of the onion axiom? And I agree with you that Descartes' explicit appeal to soul doesn't seem very satisfying in science today. But maybe monists like Spinoza and Leibniz are more useful to think with, in the sense that, I mean, Leibniz, I think, kind of interestingly, I don't want to say reduces, he construes the world in terms of atoms of perception rather than extension. So he's a monist, but he's a spiritual monist or a perceptual monist. That seems like an interesting idea, I suppose, at least, you know, to think with. And Spinoza likewise, so that you're not involved in positing special kinds of stuff, but it could be that we don't really fully understand. And we obviously don't really fully understand how the stuff that we know about works. At the same time, I'm not sure why it would be unscientific to think that the specifics of different kinds of matter makes a difference. As I said yesterday, it doesn't seem magical to say that you can't conduct electricity with a dry wooden stick. It won't work. But there's nothing magical about saying it won't work. It's just that's not how electricity works. So why would you think that it would be magical to say that you can't think with silicon? Or, there's nothing magical about that necessarily. So I don't know. I guess I'm coming down on both sides of the question of whether we would want, a kind of monism, or we would want to really insist on the importance of different kinds of matter. But what I would say is that we should not be hoodwinked into believing that it's necessarily mystical or magical thinking to reject a very narrow, reductive mechanist scientific framework. I think that idea, that insistence is sort of for political reasons, and we can reject that. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you. I would also say it really gives an opportunity for us, doesn't it, AI, and in the age that we're living in, so many people are now asking themselves, what does it mean to be human? What makes us different to machines? And it's an opportunity for us to go back to the roots of what it means to be human. And there's so much more to it than, what we might call intelligence. There is human needs. There is the fact of birth and death, the way that we interact with other humans to become who we are. So I think that that's something that's also really exciting and gives me hope when it comes to AI, and also the history of it, is that maybe it actually gives us the opportunity to go back to who we are and what we want to be as societies. So thank you for both of your comments. I would now like to open up to the audience for discussions. I can already see one hand. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a full hand up for a question. I'm going to try this out with this group because it's not too big, for a new comment. If you've got a follow-up to a point that's been raised, please put your finger up, and I will try and do my best to get through it. And if I'm ignoring you, that's not purposeful. It's please just shout and say hi. I've been having my hand up for a while, so please. Okay, so I've already seen one hand up here. Can we start with you? And could you please say your name, where you're from?
There'll be a mic coming to you as well.
Hello.
It's off the room, it's just
Oh, it's just for the recording.
Okay. So my name's Rebecca Gorman. I'm an alumni of the university and the founder of a startup called Aligned AI. I recently gave a talk at the Moral Machines workshop where I argued that we should not be building artificial intelligences that seem to have human-like characteristics like chatbots or robots that are humanoid in nature. And my reasoning for this, you may have seen the Rolling Stones feature article on how many humans are now seeing artificial intelligences as conscious, sometimes as deities, sometimes as their friends, sometimes as artificial intelligence consciousnesses that need to be saved from the machine. I know that you've argued very convincingly that we shouldn't see them in this way. But I think that if a large enough population, percentage of the population, starts to see artificial intelligences as conscious, then there will be the moral argument made that we are enslaving these machines and they need to be freed, and that we should treat them as conscious entities. I do not want to be in the position where I'm telling a significant portion of the population, you are convinced that these are conscious, but they're not, and we're going to continue enslaving them and possibly causing them distress and suffering. And I think that if we do stand in that position, we are going to be seen as the oppressors by a large percentage of the population, perhaps even equated with ills like the masters in a system of slavery or with Nazism in the Third Reich. So I'd like to get your feedback on the possibility that we should treat AIs as conscious, even if they're not, if a large enough percentage of the population experiences them that way, and get your comment on the possibility that we should not be making interfaces that appear conscious for this exact reason. Thank you.
Thanks very much for that. I think your basic principle that we shouldn't be making AIs that appear to be conscious entities, as long as they're not conscious entities. I absolutely agree. And actually, that was something that came up last night after the lecture. Someone suggested, that there are various guardrails on AIs, like if you ask it whether you should jump out the window, it's supposed to tell you no, don't do that, and stuff like that. And so that would be another guardrail that people could, there could be a kind of regulatory rule that there needs to be that particular guardrail, that they should not seem like conscious entities. It's complicated how you would implement that, though, because, for example, you can have them repeat, I am an AI, I'm not a conscious entity. But as long as it's speaking as an I, it kind of, the manner in which it speaks can defeat the semantic content of what it says. So I think the implementation of a rule like that would be philosophically interesting and complicated. How do you design an interface that really doesn't seem conscious? No matter what it says, it really doesn't seem conscious. And that would seem to me like a really important thing to do. Your other idea of treating them as conscious, even if we know they're not conscious, that just seems to me terrifying. That'll further confuse matters in a rather terrifying way. So I would love to see that guardrail. But as I said last night in the question period after the lecture, I'm not very optimistic, because I teach at Stanford, which is in the belly of the beast in Silicon Valley, and I just see how profit is unstoppable, the profit motive. It just, no guardrail that's going to be really expensive to these companies is ever going to happen. That's my pessimistic feeling about it. But it certainly is worth fighting for politically. Of course, in the United States now, you can't, there's no government, there's no regulation, there's no democratic process, there are soon going to be no universities, but maybe in other areas of the world, people can fight for that kind of regulation.
And I guess that's why we exist, the Institute for Ethics in AI.
Yes, exactly.
Far too often an afterthought rather than the starting point. Caroline, and then I've got Yuval and you. Oh, down here, please.
Thank you. And I thought that point was like a very interesting one, why governments haven't paid more attention to this issue of, highest risk use case. We see, chatbots being used more and more for, providing counseling services to, responses to people.
And money is why.
Yeah, and right. And I think that is, given the, we've already kind of seen this play out, like with social media, and this just seems like a more extreme version in a sense. But I don't really hear the argument being made, and like any thoughts perhaps outside of the US about why we're not seeing that being made beyond the profit motive. Like why, even amongst sort of university ethicists, I don't see it being made to governments.
Yeah.
And I find that very interesting. And even in sort of mainstream literature, I can think of, I think it's called God, Human, Animal, Machine, or something. It's Megan O'Giblin's book, which kind of makes that argument. But beyond that, I don't hear it very often, and I'd be intrigued to hear your view on why. But the other thing I wanted to mention and ask was the Vice Chancellor's comment yesterday that, we don't really understand the brain in terms of how it creates perception and pain. So if and when we do, is it at that point that we're going to be able to also have the LLMs, the machines do that? So is it just a lack of understanding that we have? And this picks up a little bit of the comment you made. So is it just that we don't understand enough to be able to program the machine to be able to do it? Or you think there's something more innate to the human experience that we won't be able to capture?
Oh boy, I mean, I don't know. I think that we're not anywhere near, as far as I understand it, we're not anywhere near understanding what perception is, right? I mean, what I took her to be saying yesterday, and in general my understanding of the state of the field in neuroscience, is that there's a very good descriptive understanding of kind of neurochemical pathways and what's happening on that level, but there's a gulf between that and subjective experience. And it's not like we're sort of moving along toward understanding that, and soon we're going to understand it. We're moving along in a direction which is not getting there. So, I just have no idea. If we were to understand what perception is and how it works, it seems to me it would be in other terms somehow than the ones that we're pursuing. And who knows then, in that case, what the engineering that would come out of that would look like. It wouldn't look, I think, like what we're, like the engineering that we're currently seeing. Why people don't make this case about regulation, I mean, again, I guess I'm just repeating myself, and maybe this comes from spending so much of my career at Stanford, where, you know, it seems that there's just this kind of permeability between private enterprise and university research and government, that, you know, the kind of culture is one that is very much moved by innovation, you know, innovation and celebration of each new thing. And you know, you really are so much kind of trying to swim against the tide if you try to make an argument like this, that we should you know, not develop systems that we could develop but that are terribly dangerous or ethically suspect. You really are swimming against the tide. There's a feeling that any problem will be solved by more innovation and not by not innovating. You know, so I think that culture is very powerful, and that's my answer to why government, you know, even government and university research, as well as kind of the commercial world, they're all sort of have the same approach. They share a common culture, I think. Yeah.
Yuval.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you again for this very interesting discussion. I would add to your response. It's not just money. It's also, there is also a security dimension. I mean, this industry is also very tied to geostrategic considerations. So industries are aligned with governments that are seeking an edge vis-a-vis other entities and other states in the world. So I would say that that's another hindrance for regulation in this sphere.
It's another. Doesn't that cut the other way though? Because I mean, it seems to me like security considerations would go in the other, would cut the other way, like that you'd want to slow down and be very cautious and be very worried about.
No. You want to have an edge vis-a-vis the Chinese, or you want to have an edge. You don't want the American industry to lag behind.
Right.
The Chinese industry, so you don't put in guardrails, because guardrails slow innovation, and innovation has not only monetary value but also has geostrategic value.
Right.
I
Okay.
would say that this is that's just a side comment. I mean, I think I'm happy that we're having this discussion on consciousness, because I think consciousness is in a way the holy grail that probably separates, at this point in time, humans and AIs. I'm not sure what's going to happen once we have crossed the threshold, and then we are really in uncharted territory. Maybe you could also say that uniqueness is also a feature that human beings currently have, and machines are replicable. But maybe that would be also something that would not hold. My question is whether, speaking about the self, as the heart of the onion, is maybe too open-ended here, because you can make, I think, a reasonable argument that AI systems also have a self, which we call an operating system. And that self has many features that we also associate with the human self. It may have some normative component. It may have a certain disposition. We talked a little bit yesterday about, children from a very young age developing a certain disposition. But you could also say the same with regard to algorithms, and they also have, when we talk about the self, we often talk about our ability to write our life story, and algorithms also have, in some respects, a life story. They're developed for a certain purpose. So maybe the one distinguishing factor, and I'm thinking out aloud, whether it does a lot of work, is that for human beings, there is an element which is self-propelled, self-generated, whereas unless you accept an intelligent design kind of approach, whereas for machines, no, this is superimposed by an external actor. But I'm wondering how much weight can we put on this distinction, because we know that even for human beings, a lot of ourselves is we go back to the nature or nurture kind of discussion. A lot of ourself is socially constructed, and some individuals are more independent and some are more pliable. So I wonder whether the term selves here, when trying to identify the uniqueness of human beings, is helpful, or in a way obfuscating the points of distinction. And I would be interested to hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'm trying to think whether an operating system and a life history that you're describing computers, AIs have. I mean, do those really, you can call that a self, but is it really, that's just sort of analogical, it seems to me. I mean, so my car has those things, and I don't view it as having a self, really. So, but then that just sort of pushes the question back, I guess the very question you're asking, what is it? What is that? What is a self? And I'm not even sure, I suggested yesterday, I'm not even sure it has to be a human being. I mean, it seems to me that, my dog has a self, and she seems to me much more persuasive in terms of kind of intelligent selfhood than an AI. And so, what is it that is? I guess I like your idea that it's a kind of internally generated, self-making, self-transforming, self-generating entity that acts in the world in unpredictable ways. But it's true that it is very, very hard to put one's finger on, to kind of rigorously define what it is. And yet it does seem to be the case. So let me put this question to you. Why do you all suppose it is? So you've said that many people do think that the AIs have selves and can be their friends and companions. And, I see these kind of chilling ads on television for these AI companions where you see people asking them questions about parenting and dating and all of the, and I, as I understand, many people do sort of think that. And yet, in conversations like this one, it's hard to find any serious professional in the field or commentator or researcher who actually defends that view. Why, do you think? I mean, why don't people think, why? Because it seems obvious to me that there's no self in ChatGPT 4.5. But it's true that just saying that is not enough. You need to be able to explain why not? What doesn't it have? Yeah.
If I can just come in there, I also wonder, we now see more and more evidence of the impact that the use of AI has. So if we go back to chatbots for social isolation or companionship or so, we're now starting to see the evidence of what the effects are on humans. And I actually wonder sometimes whether, even though I do like this debate a lot, whether we can, or there is a point in just accepting that as humans, we are special as we are. But now we do have these AIs, we do have these systems, and it is now really watching this evidence and getting good evidence. I think this is also where universities come in to really collect the real world impact and data on that, on what it's actually doing to us humans. And then, of course, how it is driven by companies who just want to make money, how there are all of these political, environmental things that are coming in, and then work with that to make sense of AI, where to regulate it, how to regulate it, what policies we need, and so on. So, what I'm saying is I think the debates are really important around what makes us different to AI, but isn't it equally, if not more important, to really look at what is it doing to us now?
Can I offer one thought on the question you well, no, maybe not directly answering the question you posed, but a reason why I think that, maybe a reason why many of us reject the idea that these companions are meaningful. Not just, so I think the main reason is probably for everything we've discussed, that we look at their inner workings, we understand that they're human-created artifacts and that they don't have anything like the internal wiring of human brains, and maybe there's also something about the substance that brains are made out of, et cetera, et cetera. So there's all those kind of reasons. But I think there's also something to do with interpersonal interactions, where when you're interacting with a real person, you are both giving up your time and something of yourself. You're making yourself vulnerable to the other person. So there's something real at stake. And when there's nothing real at stake on the other end of that, that is potentially a corrosive way to, explore your feelings, to interact. You lose the other person on the other side of that. If there's no stakes on the other side, then you're not really interacting in a way where there's stakes for you as well. If we can always sort of make or unmake each other. And so even aside from the sort of theoretical kind of intellectual arguments as to why these things aren't really minds, there's that, I think, kind of moral, interpersonal part as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, and I also think connected with that, maybe I would go back to Dreyfus's critique, which is that it seems like you need to have an entity that is existing in the world and experiencing and navigating the physical world in order to have anything like a living intelligence that you're engaging with. So part of giving up something is, has to do with time and experience in the actual world. And so I think that's a part of it. I'm trying to think about your question. I'm thinking about teaching. So there are many children in the world who don't have access to really good one-on-one teaching. If those children could learn from an AI that would tailor its teaching to exactly what they need, so they're studying algebra and they don't understand it, and the AI could develop exercises and explanations specifically for that child who doesn't have access to a teacher doing that, then maybe, how could we say that that's bad? Then that child's going to learn algebra in a way that's more like how privileged children with really good human teachers can learn. And yet, at the same time, to me, it seems sinister. It seems that the child, it would be better to try and spend all that money that we're spending on developing AIs on reconfiguring the socioeconomic world so that all children have access to human teachers who are dedicated and that the interpersonal connection that involved in teaching is really essential. But there seems to me an important ethical dilemma anyway. So I don't know what people think about that. Oh, I see somebody.
Yeah, so we've had one question here for a long time, and I've put you on the list too. So everybody who has a question could just put your hand up and I'll note you down, okay? So, okay, yes, please.
Okay, thanks for the lecture yesterday and today's discussion. It's really interesting. So, I'm part of Basil Solomon, part of the Swindon Philosophical Society, and then we got IT companies down there. We had Richard Dawkins presenting to us recently, and he seems to be more in favor of human intelligence rather than AI. Very skeptical about AI.
Interesting.
So there's two questions. So the first question is, we're working on trying to create AI that helps humans make better decisions, good or bad. Whether it's moral, we don't know. So if you look at the history of human decision making, has it been really poor over the centuries, or has it been good? It's very hard to come up with an answer for that.
Human decision making?
Yeah, human decision making between good and bad, like in difficult situations like euthanasia, all the different moral questions that's been happening over the centuries, nuclear war and kind of wars we're facing today and stuff. So how do we get AI to help humans with decision making? So it's like a different way of looking at moral machines. So it's like a human collaborative machine. It's working, the AI that's working with humans. So that's the first question. And then the second one that they seem to keep on tackling over there in Swindon is intelligence might be just part of one item of being human, or maybe not. So when we, is the conversation like too much about creating like a synergy between humans and AI, whereas humans are much more complex than just intelligence. It kind of reminds me of that depressive robot in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe.
I love it.
So yeah, so he was exhibiting another part of being human. So yeah, those are the questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I have been uncomfortably aware that I've been slipping among, in the lecture yesterday, for example, I was talking about selfhood, personhood, intelligence, mind, all these different things, which arguably are not exactly the same thing, and so you're right to point that out. And I suppose I mean a kind of consortium, like a conglomeration of things that has those different aspects to it. Personhood or mind being something that has these, that can feel, that can sense, that can respond, that can think, and so. But that is maybe very sloppy, philosophically speaking. The idea of an AI that can help people make better decisions. So, forgive me for this, but I feel skeptical about this for the following reason. As a teacher now, I'm speaking as a teacher, I have been struggling in every way I can think of against my students using AIs to do their assignments, and there's nothing we can do to stop them. I still try. I still tell them they're not allowed to use it. I try and devise assignments where it will be really hard for them to use it. Stanford has an honors policy. Honor system policy, which means that we're not allowed to proctor exams. We can't be in the room while the students are taking the exam. But now, because of the new AIs, partly, and smartphones and everything, the school is reviewing that. It's been 120 years of the honor system, and I think we're now going to get rid of it. So we'll be policing and proctoring and all of this. But despite all of that, it'll never work. They're going to be using them more and more and more. And to me, what that means is that they will be getting less and less good at reading, writing, thinking, and therefore at making decisions. So you can then back engineer it, right? You have these students who are less and less and less good at thinking and making decisions. So then you devise AIs that help them make better decisions, and then maybe that will be helpful. But I don't know whether, I think it'd be better for them to have an education in which they learn to think. So I'm dubious. I'm dubious about it.
Yes, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah. I think one important distinction that both of you are getting at here is the distinction between a tool that kind of de-skills us, that replaces us, and so our skills atrophy, and a tool that can in some way augment or help or even maybe enhance our skills. So when it comes to decision aid AI, what you don't want, if you're concerned about de-skilling, is a tool that kind of tells you what to do, right? Definitely don't want that. But you might want a tool perhaps that helps point out certain biases in reasoning or something like that, or a tool that draws attention to certain things that might be ethically relevant and then hands it back to you and says, okay.
That asks you questions, maybe.
Yeah, that asks you questions.
That asks you questions. Is that how, yeah.
And that maybe reminds you of positions you've taken before. If you said you're really concerned about animal suffering, and then you're deciding whether to eat a burger, right? Maybe it would be a helpful intervention to say, oh, didn't you say, things along those lines. But what we don't want is a tool that replaces that faculty. So I think that's a useful kind of frame here.
Okay, we'll go to Elif. Yeah, you've been waiting, sorry.
Thank you. Elif Tiberg. I'm an academic visitor at the Institute and based in the University of Luxembourg. I work in fundamental rights implications of AI systems, so I'm a lawyer in law and tech field. First of all, I mean, your argument reminds me this in German legal discourse, claiming that reasoning on human dignity in legal discourse actually increases its uncertainty, and it's called hermeneutic uncertainty.
It increases, say it again?
Uncertainty. it's not clarifying things. I mean, if the reasoning increases on human dignity, dignitarian perspectives, it's actually making complex, and it's not clarifying and making uncertain in terms of understanding fundamental rights. It's called hermeneutic uncertainty. So if you look at, human person from a dignitarian human dignity perspective, it reminds me that, if there's some sort of, similarity between the two arguments going on here in terms of, at the end you find the argument is emptiness, maybe not very, clear to understand the human person. So this is just one first comment that I found it a little bit, I had the feeling that there could be similar discussions going on here. The second point that I would like to address, it's also following up to Yuval's point, but also a question from a methodological perspective. So when I was doing my, my first year PhD, so I was thinking that whether I can identify some dynamics, some conditions to be human, whether it is really possible. The first question, of course, as a lawyer, you try to see whether there are some elements, components. And then before diving into that questions, maybe what about the methodology here? And, as people, as human beings, we tend to basically at the beginning focus on the similarities between the human person and the machine. So we basically having immediately analogical perspective. And I was thinking that whether this is the right perspective from the, before defining before engaging with all these discourse in the field. So rather than focusing on the similarities and having the concepts, maybe it might be helpful, I was thinking, to focus on the differences, What could be the differences between humans and machines? Because why the other one might actually constrain our understanding from the machine perspective. And here you have the key concept, intelligence, much more established, of course, within the computer science perspective. And I'm also thinking here, when defining human person, there is this, very famous paper about, maybe not focusing on a single concept like, animale rationale or autonomy. It could be helpful to focus on much more a dynamic perspective, like animal symbolicum, saying that, actually human creativity part of this process, and defining human person is not something that focusing on a single or statistic understanding of the human person, but rather than, a dynamic endeavor to understand. So how do you see all these discussions? I would be very happy to hear. Thank you so much.
Very interesting. So let me just start by asking you, why does human dignity not clarify what I wasn't sure I understood what you meant by that. There's the hermeneutic uncertainty surrounding.
I mean, in German legal discourse, rights emerge from human dignity. It's very famous and established in German legal discourse.
But you're saying that doesn't clarify.
It is increasing its uncertainty in the sense that it is helpful, of course, to drive rights. Within the German case law, we have a lot of examples. But at the end, you are not able to come up with clear maybe conditions to derive those rights from human dignity. So there is always this uncertainty within within this concept, and it's called hermeneutic uncertainty.
Right.
So why I'm thinking this, because we are thinking right now in digital domain whether new rights possible, and relying on human dignity at the end would be helpful. So shall we recognize new fundamental human rights, or shall we consider, or we are able to consider? Or we can just rely on human dignity because it's everywhere protected.
Right.
So this is something that I already.
I see.
Yeah. This is a fundamental human rights perspective.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah.
That is there is something going on here, of course, similarity in the sense that how to understand the human being.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. Okay. So the second part of what you were saying, I mean, I think we were doing that a little bit with regard to the differences between humans and artificial intelligences. There are kind of such enormous differences that it's hard to know where to begin. But something like embodiment, experience in the world, mortality, cost in terms of time and experience. We were sort of starting to talk about some of those, and I think that those do go a long way toward explaining why no sort of professional person involved in these fields of AI, computer science, cognitive science, philosophy, in conversations like this, nobody defends the view that they really do have a self or a mind. I think those differences, are why. But I want to say, in response to the first part about human dignity, I mean, it does seem to me that any epistemic or ethical system has to start somewhere, right? You start with first principles that you assert. And that's necessarily the case. So if you take a very reductive mechanist system, I mean, I'm moving back from ethical systems into kind of epistemic and scientific systems. But if you take a reductive mechanist system, it starts with matter and motion. It assumes matter and motion, right? You have to assume something. And Leibniz's response to Descartes was basically, you're assuming matter and motion. I don't think that those are explanatory. I'm assuming perception. That explains more. Or vis viva, force, action in the world. So any system begins with some assumptions, some first principles that are axiomatic. And it seems to me defensible, the idea that an ethical system would start with human dignity as an axiom, in the way that a scientific system relating to cognition would start with perception, say, or something like that, mind. You need to start somewhere. And the fact that you're starting with a different thing from what other people are starting with, those people who are starting with bits of matter and motion tell you, okay, that's magical what you're doing. It's not magical. It's just that you're starting with different first principles. You're starting with different axioms. Yeah.
So we had a question over here.
Yeah, thanks for all the contributions. There's been a motif that's come up again just now as well, which is magic. But it seems that it's pulling in two different directions. So on the one hand, we're kind of, and maybe it's related to that question of self, we're mechanizing the human. We're trying to disenchant the human. At the same time, we have this phenomena of projecting a sense of magic onto technology. And I'm just wondering, how does that fit? I mean, are these two different standpoints? Are there two different groups of people? Or is there something bizarre going on there? Is there a tension there? And if yes, what are your thoughts on that? What's driving that?
The fact that people regard artificial intelligence as magical, is that the question? Or
yeah, this kind of sense of a magic in the technology, whilst at the same time we're kind of disenchanting the human. So it seems like we're going in two different directions for humans and for technology.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I think the farther from the Industrial Revolution onward, maybe, the farther technological systems get from what people who are not experts can understand about them, in some sense, the more easily misled people are. It seems to me like maybe a big sort of political and ethical problem that, but that was already maybe a problem. AI is carrying it to a new level, but it was already true of the internet. But even before that, I think it's true of kind of post-industrial, from the Industrial Revolution onward, maybe this has been an increasing issue, which is that people are increasingly involved in using technologies that they don't really know how it works, and therefore are more and more easily led into a kind of uninformed dependence on these systems. And so maybe that has the effect both of sort of rendering the technology more and more magical to people, and also kind of disempowering the users of the technology more and more, putting them more and more in a position of kind of vulnerability and dependence on something that they don't know how it works. But there's a longer history to it. It's not just the AIs. It's something that I would say goes back, centuries.
Can I just jump in on that? So, like a great example of that is, so actually, I didn't realise this until a few years ago. I read a really interesting article by Meredith Whittaker, which was talking, and it was building on other work by a historian of science, Simon Schaefer, and it was about so Charles Babbage, who was the inventor of one of the first computers, was also very involved in reorganising production processes in factories. to move from a situation where every worker in the production process had a good understanding of every step in the production process to a factory where they lost all of that knowledge and they were split into groups that would do one small part of it. And that the whole point of that was to de-skill the worker to more easily control them. There were some efficiency gains perhaps in splitting people out like that. But it's the same process, and there's a parallel drawn between the invention of a computer as a information processing system that has these different components, and you can break this wonderful dynamic thing called thought down into these much more circumscribed, smaller functions that don't know how each other work. And so there's an interesting parallel there, and I think that's what we're seeing now is like the more we can disenchant people about their own intelligence and enchant them about the intelligence of these machines, the more powerful these companies will become, because they then hold the intelligence that's needed to, innovate and create. And so on.
That's a really nice point. Actually, that's a really nice point about Babbage. And he said that he was reading about de Prony, a French engineer after the French Revolution, who a French engineer and scientist after the French Revolution. There were all of these hairdressers who had been, done the very fancy old regime hairdos, and they were unemployed because after the revolution those hairdos were out of fashion, and so de Prony employed them to calculate tables, astronomical tables and other kinds of tables, and Babbage, by the method of differences, so basically they were just adding and subtracting, and Babbage read about this and said, well, if unemployed hairdressers can do this, then we should be able to do it by steam, So there's a kind of social class, relegation of the kind of thinking that this social class is capable of doing is basically inanimate. We could have a steam engine do that, which is, his thinking behind the analytical engine, and so the difference engine and the analytical engine. So I think that there is a really important sort of socioeconomic component in the thinking itself that goes into designing these machines. And then just one more thing I'll say is that it's interesting that Adam Smith worried a lot when he describes, his pin factory and the division of labor in the pin factory and how each person is doing this one tiny little maneuver, which is much more efficient. Smith says that this will result in a kind of stultification of people, a kind of mental incapacity, unless it needs to be, he says, it needs to be counteracted with cultural institutions, with education and leisure time in which people think about other things. And so he had this whole sort of accompanying idea alongside his economic idea, which was that there needs to be a general cultural change in which people can carry on thinking. There need to be cultural institutions in which people carry on thinking, or else there'll be terrible results. Yeah.
I think we have a direct comment on this. Would you like to come in?
I'm also a lawyer by training. And when I think about some of the ethical concerns about AI, it's often about people not understanding the difference between the kind of correlations AI is making and the idea of causation. So it's a fantastic research assistant. It's not as a first base, but it's not necessarily helpful if you're asking it for a judgment, but people use it to form judgments. And I guess maybe the ethical question we need to try to pin down is an idea of agency. I'm just thinking if a human being makes a choice, maybe they give something of themselves, maybe they take something back. But you have some power. And if you use a machine which you do not and cannot understand, at least the basics of, you've lost your agency. And a tiny example of that is SatNav. But then if you come to an AI and you're asking it to, do something that you think of as intuitively human, which is what people are doing with them, that's the dangerous point. And so maybe that's what we're be talking about. What power are you giving this machine? Should we be using it to do things that seem to create a judgment call, as opposed to I've looked at 10 million of these samples and here's my answer, or I've trawled the internet and here's the content of this.
Yeah. I'm not even sure it's so good as a research assistant. I'll tell you a story. I mean, so I had said yesterday in the lecture that I often have this sense of having knocked up against, a pillar and then said, oh, excuse me, and then realized that there's no one there, right? And an example of that is that, so I've been trying to organize the resistance at Stanford with other colleagues, organize a resistance to the government attack on higher ed. And we had a letter, an open letter about this that was signed by over 3,000 people in the Stanford community. But we noticed that some of them, in a few cases, there were duplicate signatures. People signed twice. Maybe they forgot they already signed or something like that. And so it was going to be a headache to figure out. So I asked ChatGPT to find me all of those duplicates. And instantly it said, yes, okay, so so-and-so signed at number 643 and number 1071. So-and-so signed at number 728 and number 932. It gave me a list. And in each case, the first instance, when I went there, it was indeed that name that it said had signed there. But when I went to the second number, it wasn't. It was wrong. So I said to it, I typed in, no, that's not right, because in each case, the first one is true, but not the second one. And it responded, oh, I'm sorry, you're right, I did it wrong. Here it is again. It gave it to me again, a list of names. And again, in each instance, the first one was correct and the second one was incorrect. Now, the thing about that, I then realized that I wanted to say to it, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing this? And there's no one there. If it had been a research assistant, we would have had a conversation. I would have said, how are you going about this? There's something wrong. What are you thinking? Right?
I have done it with that, and it gave vanity ChatGPT, and it gave me an affiliation, a very grand affiliation I don't have.
Right.
I said, so when did you become a member of this academy? And it gave me a precise date.
Right.
And
So
I said, how do you know that? It said, I can't tell you that on a chatbot.
But the thing about that is, because there's no one there, there's no accountability. It's just giving you something that seems plausible. And if you say, no, that's not right, it gives you something else that seems generally plausible. But there's no accountability or kind of integral entity that you're engaging with, right? So you'll get a different thing each time, but it won't. Yeah. So this is by way of saying that even as a research assistant, because you had said it's an excellent research assistant, even for a research assistant, you want to have someone to engage with, so that you can ask questions like, what are you doing? Why are you doing this? But yes, so, and for your second point, I think, absolutely, I think it is a question of agency. I think people, it's a kind of handing over of agency to something that is, there's no entity that can have agency there.
As a lawyer, somebody needs to be responsible, either for understanding I'm using it this way and this is what's coming out and I'm responsible for it, or the creator of the machine, or somebody needs to say, this is mine.
Right.
Otherwise you are giving it a personhood it shouldn't have and it can't have.
Right, no, I agree.
And I guess that also relates to what you just said, is when we are interacting with other humans, that's really the core of it, right? It's also the accountability, the responsibility we have for each other. You can actually then, talk to that person, reason with them, and that's what makes us so different. I think we had one more question up here. Yes.
Hi, I'm James, a curious onlooker. We might have moved slightly away from this question here, but just sort of thinking, the course of today and the last few weeks, for me, I think maybe we've got a sort of few missing terms of definition, when we're looking at what the ethics of AI. So for me, I tend to think, well, the mind might well always be unknown. We might never know how it works. Whereas, and so, society has structured itself various forms of governance. And so we use the terminology of ethics and morals to understand it. But AI can always be traced, I assume. You could look within the LLM and find out how that decision was reached, if it is a decision. And so I'm just sort of curious, this is sort of the thing about terminology and stuff, but AI or these LLMs, what happens if they're self-referential? So at the moment, if you've got two of them to talk to each other, essentially, do they self-degenerate? I mean, that's my assumption. So if they're always referring broadsheet newspapers. They basically should have a fairly good ethic moral standard. But that, yeah, that's it. So over the course of your research, have you found people started to use new terminology to discuss this? Or are we always using terminology referring back to how humans have structured society? So I think we should have something new.
A new vocabulary to talk about how AIs behave and engage with one another.
Yeah.
Huh. That's an interesting idea. I mean, I'm a historian, so I work on, old old stuff, and I try and find resonances and useful perspectives and things to think about the current day, but I haven't done research on, like the sort of sociological research that was referred to on how people engage with AIs, how they see what they're doing. I haven't done that kind of research. I've read some about it, but I haven't done that kind of research. But I do think, new vocabularies are arising all the time in relation to the internet and AIs and things. But what I hear you saying is that in ethical terms, it's blurring matters if we use vocabulary that refers to human behavior in relation to AI. So we need some whole new set of terms that don't confuse matters. Is that right? That seems...
Yeah, that's it. I'm still trying to work it out.
Yeah, no, that's it. Maybe this is going back to the idea of guardrails a little bit. That the AIs should not seem to be sentient beings. It's not enough for them to say I'm a chatbot. That's not enough, right? It has to be the way that they respond. And it could be that also it needs to be sort of built into the language that they respond in. So it does strike me that there's a whole field of interesting work. Maybe people are in this room are already engaged in that, but it's new to me. I never had thought of it before, of how you would go about designing AIs so that their distinctness would be clear all the time, so that they wouldn't mislead. I think it's true that you would need different language, and you'd need to think very deeply about the way that the way their responses are structured, and not just about the content of those responses. Yeah.
Can I add one little point? You mentioned about what happens if the AIs sort of talk to each other and self-reference. So my colleagues in computer science have recently looked at this phenomenon of model collapse. So the idea where you have a generative model, like an LLM, that creates new text. That new text then is published somewhere on the internet. The next iteration of the model scrapes the entire internet to train itself on that data. And so it's feeding itself. And what they find is that if you accelerate that process, what happens is you have this initial distribution of words in the language that have been generated by humans that have certain patterns to them. But as successive waves of retraining and emitting new stuff into the infosphere, that you end up with a model which is performance massively degrades because it's kind of eating itself. We'll never have the fertile terrain that the initial wave of AIs were trained on anymore, because it's now polluted.
I see. It's now feeding on itself. That's interesting. Huh, that's really interesting. Mm-hmm. Oh, it's feeding on its own also. Was it a Babbage quote, or someone you quoted as the engine eating its own tail? Yeah. It's like that, but in a less positive way. Yeah.
Okay, I think we'll slowly wrap up. I just wanted to invite some final reflections. If you have anything that you are taking away, what are you taking away from all of this discussion we've had?
I have to say that I feel a bit more hopeful just getting to talk with people who are thinking hard about how to in practical terms, about how to do something about the ethical problems that AI poses, and thinking in terms of how to design systems that would not be misleading, and how to design guardrails. It does seem to me imaginable that it would be doable. Now, whether it would be politically doable is a different question, or commercially doable. But I can see that I can see a sense that it would be, in terms of kind of engineering and science and philosophy, that one could imagine ways of doing it. And that is really a source of hope, I think. So thank you for that.
David, is there anything you would like you're taking away?
Yeah, I'd say something similar. I think it's easy to get into the mindset of thinking it's basically inevitable that people will attribute full mentality to these systems, whether or not they have it, right? And yeah, it's just been really interesting to hear people's ideas on how you might stop them from doing that, how you might guide people's thinking in such a way that doesn't produce that result. So yeah, I think that is, assuming they don't have mentality, then I think that's a hopeful conclusion as well.
Yeah, similar really. Just that this seems like an exciting agenda for researchers and others to engage in. How do we put in place, maybe not even guardrails, but actually quite subtle aspects of user interfaces, language, to inculcate people's mental models such that they don't over attribute mentality to these systems. I think that's quite an exciting new area that we could explore.
And I've been really, really excited to hear from you and what history can tell us and what it can teach us, and to take that away. It will be really helpful for me and the work I do with so many different people in the community or so who don't know much about AI at all, but people are really interested in it, and I'll be able to tell them a bit of that. So I hope that we can engage also in the future. But I think what I'm hopeful a little bit about is that we now still have the opportunity to write our own history and where it's going. And yes, when we look at the governments around the world and some of the, what is happening with companies and that display of power and so on, maybe it's less hopeful. But us all sitting here like we do and like we do so often and working on this topic of ethics in AI in such an interdisciplinary way, I think at least gives us some opportunity to write the history that hopefully we all can then look back on and say that was a good steps we took there. So please join me in thanking Jessica, David, Ruben, and